Mėly LRT.lt žiūrovai ir klausytojai, laba diena visiems, o gal labas vakaras, o gal labas rytas, priklausomai nuo to, kada jūs įsijungėte šį pokalbį. Man didžiulė garbė su jumis sveikintis ir pristatyti jums, man atrodo, ypatingai gerai Lietuvoje pažįstamą žmogų, ypatingai populiarų ir ypatingai mylimą. Aš su ta meile susidūriau vos tik tai užsiminusi savo socialinių tinklų paskyroje, kad kalbinsiu ją, divą iš Australijos, sulaukiau tų bangų, purslų ir uraganų meilės. Nedaugžodžiaudama turbūt noriu jums pristatyti knygų Paskutinės apeigos, Gerieji žmonės autorę Hannah Kent, kuri knygų savaitės proga prisijungia prie manęs. Mes kalbamės virtualiai, tuoj kalbėsimės virtualiai. Aš jaudinuosi kaip beprotė, žinau, kad šiek tiek jaudinasi ir jinai. Ir jau žinau, kad jaučia didžiulį džiaugsmą galėdama kalbėtis su savo gerbėjais, su skaitytojais Lietuvoje, juoba, kad greit tas laikas dar neateis, žinau tą paslaptį, nešiojau ją užantyje, bet Lietuvoje ir lietuviškose leidyklose ir lentynose tikrai pasirodys jos naujausia knyga. Jau nekantrauju sužinoti, kokiu lietuvišku pavadinimu ji bus išleista. O dabar aš sakau, hello again, Hannah.
Hello.
You know, I can't believe it is such an honor to meet you. And now in Lithuania, I am the envy of many people because of our conversation. And of course, I said it in Lithuanian. I am asked to pass on lots of love from Lithuanian readers. You are
Thank
amazing,
you.
and it's amazing to have this hour with you. So maybe we can start, yeah?
Yes, of course. Let's do it. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So I know it might be a trivial question, but I want to ask it. The last 2 years or even 3 years have been very challenging for the world. So have they affected you as a writer, as a creator?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. In the ways that these years in the pandemic have affected me as a person in much the same way as everyone else. We've had extended lockdowns here in Australia. The anxiety, all the sort of, the things that I think everyone in the world is used to at the moment, the concern for loved ones. As a creator, I think it has also affected me, mainly because I had a pandemic baby. My son was born just as Australia went into lockdown in 2020. So not only was I at home isolated because I had a newborn baby, but also that was doubly so because of the pandemic. And I work from home. I write from home. So the challenges that I think I would have faced anyway, being a mother to a very young child, were completely doubled by the fact that everyone else was home with me and that there was no childcare. There were no other ways that my kids couldn't go to my parents' house, all of these sorts of things. So really, the main way that I struggled was not in any kind of dramatic way, but it was simply having the space to think and to daydream and to consider the projects that I was working on and the time to write, because it was just a time of constant interruption. So I did write a book throughout, I guess, the past 3 years or so. It was one that I started 5 years ago, but it was very difficult. And I think I would never have been able to do it had me and my partner not really sat down and had a discussion and said, okay, you need to write this book. I'm going to take on all the other responsibilities. So it's felt like a little bit more of a grind, I suppose, than it normally does. But at the same time, I've been incredibly grateful for what I do have. The fact that I can work from home, the fact that my family have remained healthy. I mean, these are the important things, right? But yeah, I think it's, it impacts everyone. Absolutely.
Uh-huh. Where do you find peace? How do you relax during these things?
Oh, walking. During lockdown, we were permitted an hour of exercise outside. And I live in a really beautiful place, which I'm very grateful for because it's set in the countryside. It's incredibly beautiful. So I was able to go out and spend an hour walking amongst the trees in the forest and the bush here in Australia. And that was one way to really find serenity, I suppose. And I love to cook as well. That's my other thing that I really enjoy doing. That just helps me like breathe and take it easy.
You could be my soulmate. Yeah,
Probably.
in cooking and in walking and listening some nice music and trying to keep everything in one place.
Yeah.
Perhaps is it worth starting from the beginning? I mean,
Yeah.
you have chosen the genre of historical novel. Was there no easier way to you? I
I
mean,
actually never started out. I never thought I would write historical fiction. It was kind of by accident that I fell into it. I actually, when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a poet. I wrote lots of terrible poetry. And then when I went to university, I was really interested in writing for theatre because I liked the idea of collaborating and I loved going to the theatre. And then I think I studied creative writing at university. And I decided to do an honors year after my degree. And for that honors year, we needed to do a thesis of about 15,000 words or so. And at that stage, I had become really homesick for Iceland. I had gone to Iceland when I was 17 years old after I finished high school as an exchange student. I didn't pick Iceland, it was assigned to me as part of the program. But I had the most incredible, difficult year there. I lived for 12 months in a very small fishing village called Söderkrókur, and I was incredibly homesick, and I lived with several different families. And it was during my time there that writing and reading became even more important to me than they ever had been before. And I ended up having the time of my life there. I really, to this day, I feel homesick for that place, and I like to go back as often as I can. And so by the time I had finished my degree and I was doing this honors thesis, I was so homesick for Iceland that I decided, well, why don't I write a creative project set there? And it could be my way of writing a love letter to this country, which was, I had such an incredible experience in. And there was one story from Iceland that I learnt when I was living there that I'd never really been able to forget. I heard many stories during my time there because I think Iceland is a country very rich in stories. The sagas belong to them. The landscape is filled with, these narratives and these local histories and these stories. But I had lived very close to the site of Iceland's last execution. And I remember I have a very clear memory of driving past it. It's an incredibly beautiful landscape. It's this big, wide valley mouth, and the land and the soil are filled with these little hillocks. And I remember when I was going through there asking if the place was remarkable, what were these little hills everywhere? And the people I were with said, oh, they were caused by an avalanche some years ago. But it's interesting you mentioned this place because it was the site of a beheading. A woman called Agnes had been beheaded for her role in this very grisly murder. And I was immediately intrigued, as I think anyone would be. And I was like, oh, what did she do? And why did she do it? And I couldn't really get the answers that to the questions I was asking, which was namely, who was she? What kind of, what was her story? What was her childhood like? How did she end up in this terrible situation? And I kept asking those questions throughout the rest of my time in Iceland, and I never really got them satisfied. And so by the time I came to sit down and write this thesis, this creative project for university, I thought maybe I could start writing about this woman that I've never really forgotten about. And I could ask myself, who was she? How did she end up in this situation? And I started writing what would then become the beginning of Burial Rites. And I became so involved in the project and I enjoyed the research so much that I decided to continue it then as part of a further study. And so really, it wasn't something that I intended. I wasn't drawn to historical fiction because I was necessarily interested in the past, although I think I am. It was more just this person. I was so interested in this woman that in the process of writing her story, I necessarily had to learn, how you find out about what people used to eat and drink and what life was like in a different culture. And I think that made me fall in love with writing historical fiction. It made me realize its power to actually speaking to a contemporary world as well. So
mhm,
that's the very long answer of how I ended up writing
it's
historical fiction.
amazing.
It wasn't intentional at all.
Yeah. When I read the burial rites, I went online to find out how you managed to recreate the atmosphere of the time and place in this way. And I couldn't believe that an Australian had done it. So, can you explain to me how you did it? Has living in Iceland helped you, or is there magic here too?
Yeah, it's I was so concerned about getting things wrong because I knew I was writing about someone who really lived. And Iceland, Iceland is a small country. There are not so many people who live there. And I think Icelanders also have a very strong connection to their history. So I knew that if I didn't do my research, if I got something wrong, I was going to have a bunch of really angry Icelanders maybe one day, calling me up or emailing me, telling me, how dare this Australian come in and like just appropriate our history. So I thought of research as kind of an ethical responsibility in that regard. And so I spent a lot of time doing it. I spent about 2 years researching that book. And that involves reading everything. So not just, history books in the most conventional sense, but recipes and proverbs from that time. And I read as much as I could, really dry academic papers about the prevalence of smallpox and mortality of children, right through to, Icelandic films. I think I did have an advantage because having lived in Iceland, I had an understanding of the language and I could speak it to a certain extent. My grammar is terrible, but I can understand it. And so that allowed me to then translate a lot of this material that I had. So I think had I not been to Iceland and already loved the place and lived in that landscape and could, knew the language and loved the language, that it would have been too difficult a task. So in one sense, yeah, I was able to sort of lean into my own experiences and my own knowledge, but I also spent a lot of time just, indiscriminate reading and accessing that culture and that time and that place. So when I came to write the book, I could stick to what events I had discovered that I knew to be true, and anything that was maybe disputable or was obviously, biased or prejudiced, because, the history books are filled, they're written by a human hand. They're filled with prejudice and certain ideologies. I was able to sort of compare and contrast and find the most likely situation. And it was only when I could find nothing, when I was just confronted with absolute silence, that I felt free to invent. So that book was very much guided by this kind of, these 3 rules of research. It was something that, yeah, I took really, really serious, actually, because I wanted to, I guess, write this book not to exploit the dead, but to maybe try and just open up an understanding of history's subjective nature, the narrative of histories that we receive.
Yeah, so historical truth is so important to you when you are writing all your books, yeah? I mean,
Yeah, I think so yeah, it's I think whenever you're writing about the dead, you kind of owe it to them to try and get as much right as possible, even if you're also at the same time questioning that dominant narrative that we get from the past.
yeah. What does your creative process look like? I mean, you first of all, you are doing research and then writing, or step by step, or how do you work with the historical archives? How and what do you look for? Maybe you can spill some tea
Yeah.
about your process.
Still tea. I
Yeah.
see what's in the teapot. I think I know that I do all my research first. And that's for a few reasons. One is that when it comes to write the book, I like to lean on my own understanding and familiarity with a time and a place and the culture, because then I tend not to put in too much information that is irrelevant to the story. If I'm just completely in with the characters and the plot, and that's what I'm focusing on, all the historical detail that finds its way then generally is kind of necessary. But if I'm reading this really interesting book and I'm like, oh my God, they did this, or they ate that, I'm going to put that in the story, and it might not need to be there. So I like to just kind of do all the research first and then just focus on writing. I find that that helps me a bit better. But the other reason too that I like to spend so much time researching is because I do start out with a bit of a plan. I have a really vague sense. When I say like super vague, I'm not a planner. I fly by the seat of my pants all the time when writing, but I have a general sense of what I'm interested in. But then you do discover these amazing stories or accounts of the past, and they then might inspire me in terms of like, okay, why can't I have a character who does the same person that this person from real life did? Or, oh my gosh, that's incredible. This is something that needs to work its way into the narrative. So it's kind of a pulling and then pushing process with it. I get a lot of my ideas from the research, so I'm reluctant to start writing before I feel like I've really exhausted the material for inspiration, which is why I spend so long doing it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any, I don't know, exotic writing rituals or your, tips and tricks how to do it peacefully?
I think it's a really, in terms of tips and tricks, I think it's really important to get a library card, get as many library cards as you can, and make friends with librarians, because I think librarians and historians, they want to help and they know so much. And I used to be too shy to ask anyone to help. And then with each book, I get a little bit more confident. And, with this book that I've just finished writing, it's called Devotion. I think it's going to be published with Baltos, lankos in a little bit. I ended up bribing essentially a historian with apple pie. I made her a nice apple pie and I went to her and I was like, tell me all your stories, tell me all the juicy stuff from the past. But at first, I was too scared to do that. So I would recommend that you absolutely, get talking to librarians, because it's amazing the stuff that they know. It's fantastic. Um, but yeah, in terms of writing rituals, I used to be really particular. I used to want to start at the desk as soon as I woke up, to go from that dream state, into a writing flow. And I'd write 1,000 words a day, and I drank a lot of coffee. And then, I had children, and I think parenthood really dismantled any sense of ritual that I was developing. So now I just write when I can, and it, the coffee's always cold. It's just, you just get
I
the
can
work done.
feel your pain.
It's different now. It's different. Writing is different. But I think I've become a better writer because of it, because you have to do it. So you can't wait for the perfect time. But I used
Yeah.
to do that. I used to like everything to be just so. But now I have to just, you know, grin and bear it.
And how do you know when a story is finished?
Is a story ever finished? I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't read my books once they're published, because I just start, I want to get a pen out and change things. I think for me, there just comes a time when my agent or my publisher says, okay, we need the book now. And I'm sort of forced to give it up at that stage. Um, but I think in terms of drafting, I do a lot of drafts with my books. I think Burial writes 12 drafts of that book. So I sometimes think to myself, okay, if I feel like I'm not a very good writer, maybe I can be a good rewriter. So I do lots and lots of drafts. I rewrite and I rewrite and I rewrite. And I think I know when I'm ready to show it to someone else, because I'm still finding problems, but I no longer can come up with solutions to them. And that's when I start to need someone, like an external input into it. But all those other drafts, it's just identifying problems, and I can work out how to fix it. But eventually you have to let it go, and trust that the reader can finish the story. In fact, I think if a story is ever finished, it's when someone picks it up and reads it. I don't think a writer can complete a story. It needs to be finished in the reader's mind when they bring their own experiences and feelings to it.
Mhm. From time to time, I have some interviews with film directors or actors, and they are telling me that the hardest part of their work is to not identify with their characters and
Mm.
to let it go when everything is finished. Uh, do you identify with your characters?
No, not necessarily in that I see myself in them. But I think what's perhaps more important than identification is compassion. I think I have compassion for all of my characters, even the ones who are portrayed in a negative light. I think that's important, because I think that compassion brings its understanding of human complexity, right? I think if you can be compassionate for someone, you can empathize with their situation rather than just sympathize. And I think that is a type of embracing of the whole person. And I think that can be necessary as a writer. But I don't, put a bunch of mini me's in the book. It's I like that distance. I like the remove. But yeah, I need to get myself to a point in creating them that I really feel for what they're going for. I just want to care about them at the end. Yeah.
So when you finish a book, isn't it so hard to let go of everything you went through with it? You
It
let
is. In fact,
simple? Uh-huh.
yeah, I find it hard to let go of my characters, because, you spend all these years developing this care and compassion for what they're going through, even if it's fictional or fictionalized. And then, I don't know. I remember once, actually, Margaret Atwood, I think, talked about, she was at a dinner party, and people were talking about this kind of person that they knew and something that they were going through. And she sort of chimed in and said, oh yeah, a friend of mine, the same thing happened to them. And then she realized that she didn't have that friend. It was a character in one of her books, and she'd completely confused the lot. And I think I kind of think of my characters in the same way. They're more than just, these creatures on paper. They feel very three-dimensional and present. Because, so much of developing a character is off page as well. Stuff about them that doesn't make it to the book by the time you finish. And I think that means that they do feel very real. I think particularly Agnes Magnusdottir from Burial Rites, I really feel like she had a real presence in a certain way when I was writing that book, and I still feel that. I have a picture of her grave in my writing study, and because that book, meant so much to me, and I found out so much about her life and really did come to care for her very deeply. And I think I still feel that sense of allegiance to her. And I think about her all the time, even though obviously we have never met. She never had any children, doesn't have any descendants directly. I think about her a lot, and I'm very grateful to her. I think because writing Burial Rites was really my way of starting point of my writing career. Her life story and her tragedy have in many ways given me so much. So yeah, I do keep her in mind.
Yeah. Your books have a powerful female voice. Is this important to you personally to show historical truth in the
I
on
think so.
one hand? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. History, as we know, Western history in particular, is so dominated by male voice. They were not only the gatekeepers of history, but also they were generally occupied the positions of authority. The priests, the doctors, the historians, the teachers, the people in power, the judges. These were often all male, and so whenever they were representing women, not always, but sometimes I think with our contemporary mindset, we can recognize that, there's sometimes misogyny involved, or there's a certain attitude towards women which enters into that kind of representation. So I think a really good way to sort of disrupt that and to suggest an alternative truth or an alternative representation is to really zero in on a female experience, because so much of that has been either omitted or misrepresented in historical records. And I think it can be very powerful for people to read that and to maybe hold it up to something else that they've already received from school or from books they've read and think, oh yeah, maybe there's another way of looking at this. Maybe there's
Yeah.
another aim. Yeah.
But is it difficult to find an authentic testimonies of women in the historical sources,
Yeah,
or,
absolutely.
or
There are many women who wrote things which have entered the historical record, so letters and diaries, and that's wonderful that we have those sources. But you have to keep in mind that many of those women were women of means. So they were women who had education. They knew how to write. Literacy was and still is a massive problem for so many women around the world. Education was denied to women for many, many years in many places. So these women received an education enough to be able to write, and they also had the time which permitted to them to write. But if you take someone like Agnes Magnusdottir or Nance Roach, who is in my second book, The Good People, these were women who had no means really to articulate their experience or to represent themselves in their own words, because they were either silenced by the communities and the authorities that they lived in, and they didn't have, the literacy to either tell their stories or the materials required to even do that, or even the support system, people that they might pass an oral history to, who would pass it down the generations. So I think these sorts of things are absolutely something to keep in mind whenever you consider women from the past. It's just so many of them never had the opportunity to tell their stories, and even if they did, many were disregarded as well. So.
Mhm. So I already know how your love story with Iceland started, but what about Ireland, Prussia, and such a different centuries and ages? Are these places and times dictated only by random stories and sources, or you especially looking for something there?
Oh, it's totally random. Like I said, I fly by the seat of my pants. I wish that I was much more organized than I am, but I'm really not. I kind of take inspiration where I find it. The Good People was started because when I was researching burial rites, I was finding so little information that I was kind of trying to think, okay, where else can I look to find stuff about Agnes Magnusdottir? And I thought to myself, why don't I read newspapers from that time, particularly English newspapers, because I knew that often if there was executions abroad, they would make a note about it. They had sort of these crime pages, and I thought maybe there's an execution in Iceland, maybe they mention it in this English paper, and they didn't. But I was reading these articles and about these terrible crimes and these sort of what was going on at the assizes and so forth. And I found this article which was reporting from Ireland where they said this very old woman, they called her superannuated, someone very old, unnecessary peasant woman, as in their using their words, had been accused of a very serious crime. And she had defended herself by saying that she was not a criminal. She was, in fact, a fairy doctress, and that she had been trying to cure this child from being a changeling. She was trying to turn a changeling back into a child. And I remember reading this and thinking, okay, this seems like so strange to my understanding. Is this something that she's just saying to try and get out of these charges, or is this something that she genuinely believes about herself? And if she does have this belief in the fairies and in these very sort of folkloric beliefs, what would it have been like for her to live in that kind of world? And that was really the start then of, as soon as I finished burial rites, I remembered this article, which I had copied out into my notebook. And I thought, Nance Roach, I want to go back to this old woman and her trial and what she said about herself and what she said about her faith, and see and just explore it, see if I can find any other information about the trial, see if I can find any information about her life. And what I ended up finding was really nothing about her, because she was, to put it in a very cold way, a nobody in the eyes of the country and all the authorities around her. But I found instead this incredibly rich, contemporary too, folklore and faith system. And I discovered that my initial reaction of, oh my God, what is this, was actually completely disrespectful, because there's many people in Ireland who continue to believe in the fairies, and it's very important to them culturally. So I was really humbled through the research process, and that then really fed into my representation of three women who I guess caught up in that time in history where they are these old ways, these oral histories, these folk traditions are sort of being changed by what is now the contemporary world, through industrialization, through continual like religious problems and suppression of the Catholics and things like that. So in many ways, that article then branched out into all these other areas of interest that I discovered through research. Yeah, so that was quite random. Yeah.
Have you ever been in Ireland?
Yes, I went for the book actually.
Yeah. Did you
I
like it?
Yeah, I loved it. It's so beautiful. I grew up playing Irish music. I was in an Irish folk band when I was a
Okay.
kid, so I like played the bodhrán and the tin whistle and stuff. So growing up, I was like really comfortable around Irish music and a lot of the stories and other sort of cultural artifacts that came to me through that. So going there, it was like going home in some ways, because I'd already experienced so much of it, even in Australia. But yeah, it was such an incredibly beautiful place, and where all these events happened in Killarney in the southwest of Ireland is just like, it's beautiful. It's so
Uh,
beautiful. It's the sort of place you go to as a writer, and you're like, how can I get this on a book? How can I do it justice? And the challenge of that is part of the fun as well. Yeah, but I'm so glad I did go there. I don't think I could have written the book without having gone to
mm,
Ireland and seen that particular landscape, because it was such a big part of that folk belief.
yeah. Yeah. Your books are full of magic and superstitions,
Mm.
uh, especially in the good people. Yeah. How much do you believe it in yourself?
That's a good question. It's funny. I remember, researching the good people, and even when I was writing it and thinking to myself, well, I don't have any superstitions. And then I remembered that every time I was cooking and I spilled salt, you throw it over your shoulder. And it's not because I believed that something bad was going to happen, but I just felt more comfy doing it. And I started to see, actually, everywhere you go, we are still surrounded by superstition. And even if we don't take them maybe as seriously or believe them, in such a complete way, we still like to do things to try and give ourselves the illusion of control, right? It's like you touch wood. That's something we do a lot here, and people still will do it.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. All these sorts of things that we sort of still have that are residual, I think, from older times, but still kind of hold a certain kind of power over us. Um, and so, that was really interesting to me too. And in terms of all the others, I think ghosts and the supernatural come into my work a lot. And that's partly because people believed in these things in the past, and it's about being historically accurate. But, these stories and these beliefs are never actually about the ghosts themselves. It always reveals stuff about the living. These things speak to our fears and our desire for certainty, and that's what I find interesting about them. So it doesn't even really matter if they're true or not, so long as people still will engage in superstitious ritual or will hold some belief or have these ghostly or supernatural experiences, it's still commenting about the human condition.
Yeah, so magically. Hannah, there's still some time left before your latest book comes out in Lithuania, but I want to talk about it at least briefly. Devotion is a queer historical romance. How was the idea for this romance born?
Again, quite randomly, I didn't set out to write a queer romance. I knew I wanted to do something a little bit different after Burial Rites and the Good People. I wanted to try and, I didn't want to paint myself into a corner doing the same thing. I didn't want to pick a woman who had committed a crime from history. I thought, that's going to start to seem formulaic. I want to try and stretch myself as a writer a little bit. And I was interested at the time about writing about the Prussian immigrants who arrived in the colony of South Australia in the first half of the 19th century, mainly because I think it's a narrative that's really well known in this place where I live in South Australia, but not so much in the eastern. Sydney's like Sydney, Melbourne, people there don't really use necessarily even the same words that we would. We have this sort of like a lot of German language has been absorbed parochially. We have a lot of the viticulture and food culture. We have the Barossa, which is this very famous wine region here in South Australia, which is full of this kind of German Prussian heritage. And I thought this would be really interesting to write. And I haven't written about Australia yet, and this might be an interesting thing to do. So I was sort of sitting with these ideas, and I was like, okay, so if I have the setting, if I have the landscape that I'm interested in, what kind of story am I going to tell? And I did a bit of early research about these Prussian immigrants. I knew that they were known as old Lutherans. They had been persecuted for persisting in their old ways as Lutherans rather than join the Union Church of Prussia. And I thought, well, this is interesting, right? This idea of these persecuted communities coming over to a colony, which is stolen land, and essentially, maybe not directly, but inadvertently, and maybe even deliberately, persecuting the people who were originally here, the paramount people, the indigenous people, Aboriginal people. Thought that's an interesting thing to explore. And then I thought, okay, well, zooming even further, what do you want to write about within this community? And I thought, I've written about some really dark stuff with my previous books. Maybe I could explore something which is a bit lighter. And I thought friendship. I'm going to write about friendship between women and how important this must be to them as they make their way from these small villages in what is now Poland all the way down to South Australia. And then some things happened in Australia. It was 2017, and we had a national vote, a plebiscite, to decide whether or not same-sex marriage would be permitted in Australia. And the people of Australia said yes. And then eventually the politicians, followed through and legalized it. And I'm married now to my wife. And I remember at the time thinking, friendship's not going to cut it. I need to write a story that I would want to read. I want to write a story. I've always been so interested in what is absent in history. There are so few representations of same-sex relationships, of queer romance within history. And even if you do find it in fiction, it's so often rooted in shame and punishment. Is there a way that I can still write about Australia and Prussia and these very religious immigrants and also center a queer romance? And that was the challenge that I set myself. But as soon as I decided that it wasn't friendship at the heart of this novel, that it was a love story, that's when I found the heartbeat, and that's when the characters really came together. So I knew sort of, I had that gut intuitive feeling that yes, this is the right story to tell.
Mhm. Doesn't scare you that the plots of your books have so many parallels with today's world? I mean, outwardly we are so tolerant, but from time to time the signs of hate for the other keep popping up.
Mm. Yeah, it's
Doesn't
true.
scare you?
I think it interests me more than scares me because I accept that it's a fact of existence. You're always going to have very different views. You're going to have people who don't like other kinds of people and will other them. And people like to align themselves with groups and with communities and with certain ideologies. And a lot of that requires that you reject certain things. So, I accept that that's a part of it. I don't agree with it, but I accept that it's part of human experience. But as a writer, that interests me because it shows me that not a lot changes over the course of history. Our customs might change, the food we eat. I'm sitting in a really secure house with, heaters and air conditioners, it's modern setting with all the conveniences of modern medicine, all these sorts of stuff. But essentially, I'm still a human who has the same fallibilities as people who lived 300, 200, 100 years before me. We all feel love. We all get scared. We all wished to be loved. And so it's these sorts of the universality of some experiences and emotions that I try to zero in on. And I think with this book, I could have made it about the way in which so many queer people continue to feel shame. But I was aware that I was contributing a queer story to that community and to the world. And I thought, what is rarer still is a novel that manages to elevate a queer relationship and focuses on the love despite the various challenges and difficulties faced by the couple. I really wanted to portray this love as being something that is beyond time and that is about that completely gives these characters' lives meaning, to the extent that it is almost divine. That's what I wanted to do because that's the kind of story I wanted to read. I was really uncomfortable with my own sexuality for many, many years. And I think if I had read a book like this, it might have given me hope at a time when perhaps I didn't have as much.
Yeah, I read your interview in which you say that devotion is like a love letter to your wife.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful that you can declare your love without any fear. So maybe your personal example can be an inspiration for those who still live in homophobic societies, because here in Lithuania, we have such a big problem with this topic. I mean, the same gender marriage is it's like a cherry on top, but
Mm.
every day hate speech and other homophobic stuff. Yeah, it's insane. So
It's so
yeah.
hard, and I completely understand it because I mean, it's one thing to say that I could write this book without fear, but I don't think that's true. I've received abuse in public, and the vote that I mentioned in Australia earlier, that was a terrible sort of year because it gave a lot of people permission to very publicly state their reasons against it, and there was a lot of homophobia and hatred which came to the fore. Um, but I do think that I have been helped in my own life by people who have chosen to take the high road and to, love in the way that is right for them and to be open about that love and to refuse shame, even though people would put it on them. And so this book did feel like a risk. I was also aware that it's like me coming out, like outing myself in a really huge way, which is terrifying because you don't know what you're going to cut, you're going to hear back. You don't even know if people are going to be interested in reading a story like this, if they're just going to throw it across the room because it's not relevant to their lives. But I thought to myself, you know, if this is a book that me and my wife, Heidi, would enjoy reading and would feel validated by, then that alone is worth it. And so, you know, that's why the book in so many ways is a love letter to her, and it's dedicated to her, because ultimately, if everyone hated it and she liked it, then it would still be worthwhile.
I'm shocked now because of reactions about devotion in Australia. It's absolutely surprising for me that there
It's
was
been,
people who hated it.
oh, not so much that they hated devotion, more just that they hate, you know, there are
The
people who
topic.
still don't believe in same-sex relationship.
Mm.
Actually, the books came out last year in November, and I was anticipating more, I guess, angry emails, and I have received none. In fact, you know, I have lots of readers who are quite elderly, or and many of these people, you know, they're in their 80s, you know, are writing to me saying thank you. This is a beautiful love story. I really enjoyed it, and you know, that's a really wonderful surprise to me. So, you know, and I think that goes to show that I think no matter the risk, it doesn't matter the subject. I think it's is worth taking creative risks
Yeah.
and writing the stories that you want to read, because you never know who else also wants to
Mhm.
read them out. Mhm.
Yeah. By the way, do you know French director Céline Sciamma? She
Yes, I
created,
do.
yeah, The Portrait of the Lady on Fire is absolutely
Right.
amazing queer romance, historical one, by the way.
Yeah,
So
isn't it amazing? I loved it. I did see it and I loved it. And I think that's another really good example of just the incredible reaction to that film. Just goes to show that I still think that there is a hunger for, you know, for this kind of subject matter, irrespective of whether or not it's relevant to you personally. I think still people are so interested in seeing, you know, because there's just been so little of it, right? There's just been a dearth of these kinds of narratives. And I think when you find someone like Celine Sciamma, who is able to really pull such beauty and poignancy out of a story like that, it's just amazing. Yeah,
outstanding,
incredible.
yeah, yeah. I called you traveler in time and space. Where would you live if you could live anywhere and anytime?
Mm. I think that question's so hard, you know, because immediately I start to think, okay, if I'd been born, you know, 100 years ago, I would have died. I would be way dead by now. You know, I was really sick as a kid. Like I needed modern medicine to keep me alive. Um, you know, even I had really, this tell me if this is too much information, but you know, I had a hard childbirth with my first child. And, you know, I probably would have died had it not been, you know, in contemporary times. So as much as I think sometimes I can, and I think we all are sometimes, like a romanticized version of the past. You know, I like to think about what would it have been like to live in a place where there are no like electricity or power lines, and that you don't have that constant hum of electrical objects in your house, and everything is by candlelight, and you know, there's all these other cultural practices which we have lost. And it seems really attractive to me. And then I still have to think, oh yeah, but if you were able to time travel back there, I think you'd be like pretty quickly. You know, as a kid, you would have definitely died, and maybe also as a young adult. So you know, I don't like your chances. But I think I'd like to go back to sort of a pre-industrial time. I think that would be really interesting. Yeah, just go to it.
Because
I
of
don't.
dresses? Because of dresses or because of what?
Maybe not the dresses. I don't know. They seem like a lot of work. There's a lot of laundry in the past. You start going into women's histories, you find out just how much work was involved in keeping everything clean and cooking and preparing food. You know, like you don't get a lot of rest. But yeah, I would be interested in going back there. I think just for not staying too long. I think I'd like to come back to contemporary times, even, you know, begrudgingly. But
Mhm.
there's a lot to, you know, there's a lot of violence in the past. Women didn't, if I could maybe shapeshift, maybe be a man in the past, maybe be an educated man in the past, that might be different. But if I had to go back as I am now, I know I'd just be end up working on a farm somewhere, you know, just not doing much but working, to be honest. I feel like that would be my fate in another time. I don't think I would be able to write for sure. That's one thing.
In which language would be you would speak if
Oh,
you could you
I'd
could
love to go back to Iceland.
yeah?
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
why I'm asking? I'm asking
Why?
because I know that most beautiful word in the world is in Icelandic for you. Yeah? I read
Yeah.
your interview when you said that I don't remember this word, but it was as Icelandic. The most beautiful word.
There's a few words because I think Icelandic, like German, they combine words. They have lots of
Uh-huh.
compound words, which then give rise to new meanings that I think English can be an impoverished language sometimes. There's a lot of words for things in other languages that we don't have. And maybe it was kveldvaka, which means in Icelandic that time at night, like twilight time, where you light a candle or you start to, someone would, in the old days, someone in a bathstoffer, this common room, would start to read aloud by the light of a candle while everyone was maybe doing knitting or just relaxing. And it was this time of, it sort of translates to sort of night awake, this kind of time at night when you would all be together to tell stories. And I've always loved that word. I think it's really beautiful. I'm not sure if
Can,
that's the one you're thinking
can
of,
you
but
repeat it? Can you repeat it once again?
Kveldvaka.
Oh my
Kveldvaka.
God.
I'm not
I'm
sure if
a
that's the one,
musician.
but yeah.
I'm a musician, but I can't repeat it after you.
Look,
Yeah,
I think my Lithuanian stops at, like, I don't know, sveka. Is that the word? That's
yeah,
hello,
it's
maybe?
hello. Yeah,
Labas?
it's
Yeah,
hello.
that's
It's
about
hello.
it.
Labas,
So I
labas.
don't
Yeah.
think, yeah, I don't think you should apologize for not speaking Icelandic because I think Lithuanian seems much more difficult.
Okay. So Hannah, are you writing anything now, or you just searching, researching, and daydreaming about something?
A little bit of daydreaming because I'm still thinking about what novel I'm going to write next. I have a few in mind, but I would like to travel for some of them. And it depends, with obviously the pandemic, whether or not I'll be able to do that soon. But I'm actually, in terms of what I am writing at the moment, I wrote a screenplay, which is very different to my novels. It was initially the idea was based on what was going to be my third historical novel. And then it's kind of evolved into a psychological thriller about this woman
Okay.
who is a fertility specialist, and she has this daughter who starts to talk about another family that she owns, another existence. And I guess it's about ghosts in another way, in a contemporary way. And I've been working on this for probably about 4 or 5 years. And now I think they had their second or third day of shooting the film in Victoria. So it's being made as we speak. So I'm doing a lot of last minute changes, getting phone calls from the director and
Yeah.
changing it up. But I think it's going to be really great. It's starring Sarah Snook, who I don't know if you guys have Succession over there and if you've been enjoying that show, that American show. She's in that, and she's an Australian actress and really talented. And yeah, I'm excited to see it now. So yeah, that's what I'm writing at the moment. But screenplays have been really, really exciting and a nice way to kind of, a nice thing to do amongst writing historical fiction because writing books can be a really solitary experience. So it's been really fun to be involved with a film and to get to talk to producers and,
Yeah.
do a lot of
It's
collaborative
gonna
stuff.
be it's gonna be launched online or cinemas
I'm,
or
I'm not sure. It does have international distribution. So I guess we'll see. Yeah.
so
See what form
interesting.
that takes.
So Hannah, this is my last question. I'm so upset about it, but what books do you read yourself? I mean, do you have a book of the year or something like that?
Oh man,
No.
I like to read all sorts of things. I think there has been an author though that I've discovered in the last couple of years who is just I just take my hat off to, and that's Max Porter, who wrote Lanny and Grief is the Thing with Feathers. He's a British writer, and those books are very small, but they pack such an emotional punch, and they are also they're written in the most exquisite way possible. Very literary but accessible. They're playful. I think it's incredible, and I find myself reading his books and then wanting to go write. Like just so inspirational. And there's many Australian writers who I really enjoy reading as well, um, and who I read a lot of actually when I was writing Devotion, just as a point of comparison to see how the landscape came through in their work. So people like Alexis Wright. Um, I read a lot of poets. Um, Uh, Carol Ann Duffy is a favorite. When I was writing The Good People, I read a lot of Seamus Heaney, and I still like to read him because I think he's a wonderful, wonderful poet. But all sorts. I think when I was younger, I was like, oh, I want to be a serious writer. I better read really serious books. So I, read a lot of Tolstoy. And now I just tend to read everything that I can. I wish there was an extra day in the week just for reading. I just never have enough time. But
Yeah, me too.
yeah. Yeah, I like to read it all now. I'm less of a snob than I used to be.
Mhm. So, thank you so much. It was a huge pleasure to listen to you.
Pleasure is
Yeah,
mine. Thank you so much for having
so
me.
happy to meet you. Yeah.
Well,
I hope
likewise.
that our conversation will explode Lithuanian internet. I'm not hoping. I'm sure it would be. It would be the true. Ačiū labai visiems žiūrėjusiems pokalbį su Hannah Kent. Jeigu dar neskaitėt, netyčia taip atsitiko, kad neskaitėt paskutinio apeigų arba gerųjų žmonių, jūs privalot tai padaryti tučtuojau. Tai yra, nuoširdžiai prisipažįstu, kad tai yra vienos įspūdingiausių mano skaitytų knygų pastaraisiais metais. Ir aišku, kad visi labai laukiam Devotion. Aš tikiuosi, kad kažkas man šiandien išduos, kaip jinai bus pavadinta lietuviškai. Ačiū, kad buvot. Žiūrėkit ir kitus knygų savaitės pokalbius. Dalyvaukit aktyviai, skaitykit, nes, kaip aš mėgstu sakyti, skaitimas kaip pripildo širdis ir sielas. Ir tikrai ne tik pandemijos metu, bet ir šiaip darosi lengviau ir turiningiau gyventi. Ačiū, kad buvot. Iki.